Our next speaker is Dr. Miguel Santo, who is also at the KU Leuven at the Department of Brain and Cognition at the Leuven Brain Institute. Miguel is a postdoc in the laboratory of Johann Wagemans, and today he's going to be talking about object categorization and response bias flexibly change depending on cross-spatial scale coherence and task demands.
Okay, something is happening. My screen not sharing properly.
We can see your screen now. It's not at the slideshow though. It's your.
What now?
I think we have some kind of presenter view that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's the presenter view.
Okay. About now?
Yeah.
Perfect, yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you for that introduction. And as Elaine said, I'll be talking about some aspects of object categorization. And how these things interact with cross-spatial coherence and task demands. So it's good that I follow Hans because he already talked about some things that I'm going to describe now. But basically, many studies have shown that categorization does not always necessarily follow a strict fit for the hierarchy. For example, like Hans showed, studies investigating expertise in certain visual domains consistently show that experts can perform categorizations of the highest level of specificity as fast as categorizations of the middle level of specificity. So you can think of how bird experts can name the species of a bird as fast as naming any given type of animal. One potential explanation for that could be that visual experts are able to pick up relevant visual features in the coarser scales and then predict where the finer scales are, and then jumping ahead in the visual processing pipeline. So if we are able to disrupt these relationships between the coarser and the finer scales, we could have a window into how these configurable properties present in different spatial scales interact with task specificity and response certainty. So to do that, I use this image manipulation algorithm called the Eidolon Factory, which basically decomposes an image into its scale space representation. If you have questions about that, we can talk about it later. But basically, it just creates this stack of blurred versions of the original image. And then in order to get a handle on the coarse and fine parts of the image, it basically just subtracts one layer from the other iteratively until you get a full stack that goes from blobs to fine edges. Then, in order to disrupt these scales, we actually introduce random disarray fields that deform the appearance of the image. This is called a parameter reach in this algorithm, and it's basically just a measure of pixel displacement. But the crucial part of this algorithm is that we can control how these arrays interact with each other. So take, for example, this cartoon example of an original image. The larger circles represent the coarser scales, and the smaller circles represent the finer scales. If we contain the deformations of the finer scales to the coarser scales, then we get an eidolon. This is what we call this interface, where the edges are kept, but the appearance is deformed. However, if we then let the finer scales behave independently from each other and from the coarser scales, we get an incoherent eidolon, where the edges are diffused, but we still deform the appearance of the image. So in my task, I did that to images of animals, peoples, and objects. And I presented these images in a smooth sequence going from very disarrayed to original image over 15 seconds. Participants were allocated to two between subject groups. In the first group, they had to detect the presence of a human face among these two distractors, so a basic level categorization. In the second group, participants had to detect the presence of any type of face, so human and animal, among the distractors. For their task, they had to stop the sequence of this array at two levels of certainty. First, using their gut feeling to respond, where they would lift the spacebar and say yes or no, the target is present. And then by pressing down the spacebar again, they would be able to then, they were instructed then to stop only when they were sure about the appearance of the image. And here you can see how the deformation progressed over time in a logarithmic. So this is just an example of how it can look like. Hopefully you can see the images becoming clearer over time. Yeah, that's good. So now let's look at the stopping point results. So here we can see the results for the gut responses, where they stop. We find that a basic level advantage where human faces were detected earlier than any type of face. But we didn't find any other effects of our disarray. However, for sure responses, we actually see the opposite effect, where human faces actually became participants in the human face detection group actually took slightly a bit longer to be sure about their response than those in the any face condition. But we also find a small effect of the coherence of the disarray, where coherent sequences where the edges are kept actually impair the detection of targets. Then we also looked at signal detection theory measures, but only for the window is covering, but only for gut responses, because show responses were at ceiling of performance. So we looked at D prime, but we found no significant effects for this, as you can see from the plot. But we also then look at response bias, and the results are more interesting here. We found first that, okay, human faces, participants in human faces tend to have a larger tendency to say yes, that the target is present, but that's normal because if you say look for a face, they're likely to see faces everywhere. But the interesting result is at this level here, it seems that the presence of edges actually increased the tendency to say yes, but for the any face group, actually made participants behave unbiased. So they were actually performing at the mean of that distribution. And this effect here, or this increased tendency to say yes that is observed here, is larger for the any face group than for the human faces group. So how do we interpret these results? First, we propose that in line with previous research, the basic level is the most likely default entry point, but it could be that it depends on the mode of viewing that the observer is employing. Superordinate representations may be only triggered when sufficiently similar visual feature information accumulates so that you know that you are looking at a larger group of similar features. When thinking about the response bias results, we see that there is an interaction between coherence and group assignment, which highlights that tasks demands can affect the way that global and local visual information is being abstracted. And if you think about the responses at the gut level from the response bias as well, we propose that the visual system is rely on matching the local structure to appropriate templates to build a visual representation of the incoming stimulus, regardless if it's the right stimulus, the right target or not. The edges are important, is what's giving texture to your decisions in a more poetic way of explaining. So in conclusion, it seems we offer a bit of a slightly different twist to the traditional view of these abstraction levels in the visual hierarchy, but we also seem to support the initial assertion that visual categorization does not necessarily follow a strictly feed-forward pipeline. And thank you, that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for a great talk. So if any of our panelists have any questions as well, you're welcome to unmute yourselves. So maybe I'll just ask whether you could talk a bit more about what you think, why the response bias was so affected by the coherence manipulation, and what the.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we think that it's mostly because when the edges are present on the image, you get lots of categorizations get triggered, regardless if they are of the right category or not. So depending on the group, that seems to increase their tendency to be that the target is present in comparison to the incoherent condition, because when the edges are deformed, you don't have distracting pieces of information that are aligning themselves to give the impression that something is there. So I can say that anecdotally, many participants reported back after their experiment that after seeing the coherent sequences, they thought that they were seeing a specific image, but then it turns out that it was completely different. I also didn't report something which is at the end of the sequence, participants were asked to rate how surprised they were by the appearance of the image. So the whole sequence, agnostic of the categorization, we just asked about the specific of the image, and we found that coherent sequences actually induced more surprised ratings. So it kind of supports that argument.
Really interesting.
I can show the results if you want for other people. And I have it in a hidden slide.
Yeah, well, if you want to.
I mean, if there aren't any questions, it's fine. Doing something weird. Hopefully stop. Not stopping. I don't know why, but I'll stop sharing because that's giving stroke attack to someone.
Okay.